It was exactly 07:42 in the morning, when the metallic sound of my keychain echoed across the marble floor of the main lobby, a sharp and solitary noise amid the hushed bustle of people coming and going. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, a promise of energy from the small kitchen on the 22nd floor, mingled with the citrusy and antiseptic scent of the freshly cleaned corridors, a combination that defined the start of all my days for the past 12 years. In the inside pocket of my jacket, a small object, but one of immeasurable weight, pressed lightly against my chest. It wasn't a luxury pen or a corporate credit card, but a cobalt blue USB drive with a small lateral crack, a gift from an old client who once told me, "Trust is the only currency that can't be counterfeited." Little did he know how prophetic his words would be. That USB drive wasn't just a mere storage device. It was my silent symbol, the materialization of my existence in that company. I used it exclusively to store the authentication fragments, the final cryptographic pieces that completed access to the 8 escrow keys, safeguarding in digital vaults scattered around the world the sum of $220 million from our corporate clients. My name is Edward Collins. I'm 38 years old, and I've dedicated the most productive part of my life to a single company, living among servers that hummed like beehives, contracts spanning dozens of pages, and encrypted codes that sounded like a dead language to almost everyone. I was the guardian of the treasure, the architect of trust, but in the corridors, I was a shadow. I've always been discreet, almost invisible, a name on an email list. But it was my digital architecture that silently underpinned the trust system, allowing hundreds of millions of dollars to be transacted securely. In that instant, as the electronic turnstile registered my badge with an impersonal beep, the brutal contrast of my reality hit me hard. To the company, I was just another employee, a cost on the payroll, a simple password guardian. But the truth no one liked to admit, was that my presence was the foundation of everything. Without my keys, nothing ran. No contract settled, no client slept peacefully. That Tuesday, however, carried something different. The sound of the printer seemed more aggressive, and I sensed in the air an invisible gunpowder smell, a tension hiding behind forced smiles and hurried conversations. It was as if every glance, disguised, already knew about a memo I hadn't read yet. The building seemed to breathe in unison with me, a heavy and anxious breath. Deep down, that invisibility had a bittersweet taste. It hurt to be ignored, but it also granted me immense and secret power. I knew the machinery, every tooth, every screw, and I knew that without my touch, it would stop turning. The blue USB drive was there, firm in the pocket, as a constant reminder. You are the last wall. They haven't realized it yet, but they will. And it was in that contrast between the banal sound of coffee dripping and the cold light of the office that the stage for the greatest implosion of my life began to be set. It had been exactly 12 years, 4 months, and 17 days of uninterrupted dedication. I joined the company as a mere junior digital security technician, a young idealist fascinated by logs, firewalls, and the elegance of cryptography. Gradually, my meticulous work and ability to foresee failures elevated me, not in the visible hierarchy, but in the hierarchy of responsibility. I became the invisible architect of client trust, the man who built the digital bridges over which fortunes crossed. I didn't appear in smiling ads, nor did I attend the champagne-fueled meetings where big deals were celebrated. My arena was the silence of data centers, the bluish glow of code screens. For every multi-million-dollar contract closed by the council, there was a dark and vital part of the work that fell into my lap. Setting up the escrow, generating multiple access keys, and storing with cryptographic redundancy the security protocols. I was the guardian of the 8 keys, the single point of failure and security, but no one liked to be reminded of that. It was too uncomfortable for those men of power
to admit that an employee without an important surname held alone the true power of the company. At the beginning, I believed the anonymity was temporary, a phase. I believed recognition would come with time, that merit would override politics. But the years accumulated like dust in old files, and I remained the silent specialist. My raises were small, the congratulations were perfunctory, and invitations to corporate parties seemed more like an obligation than a gesture of inclusion. At those events, I was the awkward figure in the corner of the room, while others laughed loudly and talked about their bonuses. Even so, I persisted. There was something inside me, a stubbornness that said, "Keep going. One day, they'll realize." In that chessboard, two characters stood out for their arrogance. First, Hugo Alencar, the CEO. A man in a gray suit, always impeccable, who loved using jargon like strategic vision and disruptive synergy, but delegated any remotely technical matter. His smile never reached his eyes, and he treated me as if I were an eternal intern. The second figure was Arthur Villefort, the incompetent heir, son of one of the founders. Arthur grew up surrounded by luxury, but his technical ignorance was abysmal. His arrogance was more juvenile and cruel. He laughed loudly, slapped the backs of those who mattered, and to my mortification, called me publicly the password guy. Once, in a crucial meeting, he interrupted me mid-explanation of a complex new security protocol. "Let the real people handle that, Edu," he said, with a mocking smile. The entire room laughed. I went silent, feeling the blood boil. The humiliation was public, and their laughter echoed in my mind for days. Each laugh was another brick in the wall of resentment I was silently building inside me. The curious thing is that despite the humiliation, I took pride in my invisibility. It was like being the lighting operator in a grand show. No one sees you, but without you, the show ends in darkness. The difference was that in my case, the show cost $220 million. They weren't aware of it, or pretended not to be. And that arrogance, I felt, was the trap they were preparing for themselves.
The day of betrayal arrived without fanfare, without thunder in the sky, but with the mathematical coldness of an algorithm. It was a Tuesday morning when I received the email. At 10:03, the subject was vague, almost bureaucratic. Report to room 19B. Subject, reorganization. The signature was from an HR assistant who barely greeted me in the corridors, someone who probably didn't even know what I did. I felt a knot in my stomach. Room 19B was on the executive floor, a place I rarely frequented, a sanctuary of glass and steel where decisions were made and careers undone. I walked there feeling the gazes of my colleagues, gazes that averted too quickly. The air seemed thin. Upon entering, the scene was set like a courtroom. At a long rectangular glass table sat Hugo and Arthur, both with arms crossed, a posture of power and detachment. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound in the room. In the center of the table, a white envelope, solitary, rested on the cold surface. My name was printed on it, but spelled wrong. Eduardo, missing the R. A small missing letter, but one that screamed volumes of disregard. 12 years of dedication, sleepless nights, solutions that saved the company from disasters, and they couldn't even bother to spell my name correctly. It was a subtle and cruel stab. Hugo began, his voice devoid of any emotion, eyes fixed on the point on the wall behind me. Eduardo, you know the market demands constant changes. We need to optimize processes, seek new synergies. Your department will be restructured, and your position, unfortunately, has become redundant. Redundant. The word echoed in the silent room. Arthur then chimed in with that mocking smile of his, a smile I learned to hate.
Nothing personal, man, but we need people who are more dynamic. Fresh blood. You get it, right? Password guy. The phrase was the final blow. They weren't just discarding me, they were ridiculing me, turning my professional identity into a joke. The envelope, the misspelled name, the bureaucratic tone, everything was part of a meticulously planned scene to reduce me to dust, to ensure I left there broken. With a hand trembling from rage and shock, I signed the termination paperwork. My mind was blank. As I stood up, my body seemed not to obey me, and the blue USB drive slipped from my jacket pocket, falling to the floor with a small clack. Arthur picked it up, twirled it between his fingers with disdain, and laughed loudly. Look at that. Even his totem fell. What's on it? Family photos? Relax, Eduardo. You'll find something better. He tossed the USB drive in my direction, a careless and distracted gesture. Little did he know he just handed me back the key to his own destruction. I left that room with a cardboard box in my hands, containing the wreckage of a decade, a mug, some cables, notes. The greater void, however, was inside me. It was as if they'd ripped out my identity. In the corridors, colleagues averted their eyes, pretending to be busy. The entire company seemed complicit in my execution. On the sidewalk, the cold Chicago wind hit me like a punch, and reality devastated me. But then, I felt the weight of the USB drive in my pocket. The humiliation still burned, but something new began to awaken. The spark of revenge.
The 2 days following the dismissal were a plunge into an abyss of silence and impotent rage. My small apartment, once a refuge, became a prison. The walls seemed to close in on me. The hours dragged on. I replayed the dismissal scene in an infinite loop. The wrong name on the envelope, Arthur's smile, the word redundant, the feeling of defeat was physical, a chest pain that made breathing difficult. I stared at the cardboard box in the corner of the room, a monument to my irrelevance. 12 years of my life reduced to a pile of trivial objects. I was a ghost, a name crossed off a payroll. On the second night, insomnia consumed me. It was 04:17 in the morning. The city's silence was absolute. Sitting on the edge of the bed in the darkness, I felt despair swallow me whole. My hand, by an unconscious reflex, went to the pocket of the jacket thrown over a chair and found the blue USB drive, the object of Arthur's mockery. I gripped it tightly, and the texture of the plastic, the scratch on the side, seemed to anchor me to reality. And it was in that exact instant, at the lowest point of my life, that the memory exploded in my mind. It wasn't a subtle thought, it was a shock wave, a crystal-clear image of a late-night work session years ago in a conference room with the legal team. We were discussing the minutiae of escrow contracts, and there it was, Clause 14.7. I had insisted on it myself as an extra layer of security, a dead man protocol to ensure the custodian's integrity. It stated with a clarity that now sounded like music, the primary key holder shall validate the digital transfer in person in case of contractual change or custodian switch. I froze. The air left me. My heart began to beat so hard it seemed it would burst out of my mouth. I jumped up, cold sweat running down my forehead. It wasn't just a memory, it was a weapon. It was the deed to my revenge. Without me, without my physical presence, without my biometric and cryptographic authentication, the $220 million was frozen, trapped in digital limbo. Hugo and Arthur, in their arrogant haste to erase me from history, had forgotten the most important lock on the vault. I ran to my small desk, turned on my personal computer, a machine with a secure operating system I'd built myself, and plugged in the blue USB drive with trembling hands. The authentication structure appeared on the screen, encrypted fragments, access logs, temporary tokens, all protected by layers of passwords that existed only in my mind. It was the architecture of trust, and I was still its sole master. I spent the rest of the early morning scouring digital copies of the contracts, confirming the clause's presence in each one. With each document read, the rage transformed into cold, calculated clarity. Despair gave way to a vertiginous sense of power. I was no longer a humiliated ex-employee. I was the invisible piece that could suddenly stop the entire game. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs for the first time in 2 days. The game was on. And for the first time, a slow and dark smile formed on my face. They had underestimated me so much that they paved the way for my revenge. We chose the moment of the attack with the precision of a general planning an invasion. It would be on a Friday at 16:09, a perfect time. Late enough for most top executives to be relaxing, thinking about the weekend, but early enough for the news to spread like wildfire across all time zones where our clients operated. I was in my apartment, on a secure video call with Laura, who was in her office. On my screen, I monitored the systems. On hers, the final notification document was ready. "Ready, Eduardo?" she asked, her voice calm. I took a deep breath. "Do it." With a single click, Laura filed the notification electronically. In the same microsecond, a script I'd prepared fired the document to the inboxes of all corporate clients, all board members, and all key executives of the company. The text was a masterpiece of corporate terror, surgical and devastating. Escrow movements detected in potential disagreement with Clause 14.7 of current contracts. We demand immediate clarifications from the board within 1 hour, under penalty of contractual nullity and activation of immediate reimbursement clauses for breach of trust. The effect was faster and more violent than we'd anticipated. In less than 5 minutes, my alerts began to beep. They were desperate login attempts to the escrow systems by the company's IT team, probably under frantic orders, all blocked. In less than 10 minutes, according to an internal source Laura had, the company's phone switchboard collapsed entirely. Executives from Zurich, investment funds from London, lawyers from Tokyo, all wanted to know what madness this was. The panic was global. But the true coup de grace was yet to come. Exactly at 16:15, the automated alert system I'd programmed activated. The giant LED screen in the operations room, the pulsing heart of the company, which normally displayed profit charts and market maps, suddenly turned red. In flashing, bold letters, a message cut through the stunned silence of the floor. "Attention. Master key absent. Transaction blocked. Contractual integrity risk. Contact primary custodian Edward Collins." Putting my name there was a last-minute decision, a touch of poetic cruelty. The scene, as they told me later, was pure chaos. All employees stopped, staring at the screen in disbelief. The air grew heavy. Panic spread like fire. The news cascaded down the floors, and the name Edward Collins, the name that for 12 years had been synonymous with invisibility, was now on everyone's lips, from interns to the board. They couldn't ignore me anymore. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. I was the eye of the hurricane. And the council, locked in their glass room, felt on their skin the fragility they'd always ignored. The trap was set and activated. Their castle was crumbling, and I had my finger on the demolition button. The summons came in the form of a desperate call from Hugo's personal assistant. It wasn't a request, it was a plea. "Eduardo, please, we need you here, now." The emergency meeting was scheduled in the same boardroom where I'd been humiliated and fired. What poetic irony. This time, upon entering, the atmosphere was completely different. The arrogance had evaporated. replaced by palpable panic. Hugo was sweating coldly, his silk tie loosened. Arthur tapped his foot nervously on the floor, his face pale and eyes wide. The room was full. Board members, the legal team, and on a giant screen on the wall, the furious and impassive faces of the representatives of the largest international clients joining by video conference. They wanted answers, and I was the only one who had them. The silence was thick when I sat in the empty chair at the end of the table, the seat they'd left for me. Hugo tried to start, his voice trembling, attempting to force a professional tone that no longer existed. "Eduardo, thank you for coming. We need to resolve this in a professional manner. Perhaps you could reconsider." I interrupted him, not with a shout, but with a cutting calm that silenced the room. Professional. 12 years of invisible dedication, and only now do you remember my full name, Hugo? Where was the professionalism when my name was misspelled on my termination notice? Arthur, in a last pathetic attempt to maintain his pose, interjected. "Look, Eduardo, let's not dramatize. It was a mistake. Just formalize your exit, sign some papers, and everything goes back to normal." I laughed, a short, cold laugh, devoid of any humor, a sound that echoed in the room and made Arthur shrink. Dramatize? Arthur, you built an empire of $220 million on my signature, on my trust. You sold your clients not the company's technology, but my integrity. And you called me the password guy while laughing behind my back. This isn't drama. It's the prologue to your downfall. I turned to the giant screen, addressing the clients directly. Ladies and gentlemen, for 12 years, I personally ensured every cent of your money was safe. Now I ask you, did they even mention my name when selling you their services? Did they explain that the security of everything depended on a single man they considered redundant? The client's silence on the screen was the loudest answer I could hope for. The weight of my words reverberated off the glass walls. It was as if finally the entire stage had turned to me, the lighting operator everyone ignored. Arthur, finally broken, lost all pretense. His voice faltered, becoming almost a whisper. "What do you want?" I looked directly into his eyes, then into Hugo's, savoring every second of that moment, the total inversion of power. "What do I want?" I repeated slowly. "I want every client to know the truth. I want you to issue a public apology admitting your negligence and governance failure. I want you to experience the same humiliation you gave me. And above all, I want the whole world to learn never to underestimate who holds the key again." The room shuddered. They knew there was no easy way out, no negotiation. I didn't want money. I wanted the ruin of their reputation. And for the first time, I saw in their eyes pure, primal fear, the fear they had always denied me. The game was over. Checkmate. The scandal exploded in the financial newspapers the following week. The headlines were brutal and direct, a slaughter of reputations. "Governance failure in $220 million escrow rocks tech giant," one read. "The Invisible Guardian, how corporate arrogance nearly caused a billion-dollar disaster," blared another. The council, publicly humiliated, was forced to issue a formal apology admitting serious failures in custody management protocols. It was a euphemism for the disaster they'd created. The consequences were swift and devastating. Hugo Alenkar resigned as CEO, his strategic vision finally exposed as an empty facade. Arthur Villefort was indefinitely removed from the board and simply vanished from meetings and public life. Rumors said he'd exiled himself to a beach house on the coast, far from accusing gazes. The company, once a fortress of trust in the market, saw its shares plummet.
Furious clients demanded a new trust structure, and many, distrustful of the toxic culture that allowed this to happen, transferred their multi-million-dollar contracts to competitors. The once bulletproof reputation was pulverized in weeks. The castle they'd built on my invisibility had become ruins. And me? I watched it all from my apartment, not with joy, but with a profound sense of poetic justice. 2 weeks later, I received a call. It was from an international financial consortium, one of Europe's largest. They'd followed the case closely and were impressed not by my revenge, but by the security architecture I'd created and the integrity I demonstrated in exposing the flaw. I was invited to lead their new global fiduciary security division. The position came with triple the salary, total autonomy to build my team, and, most importantly, respect. In my first meeting in the new role, in an imposing room in Geneva, I sat at a dark wooden oval table. The atmosphere was of seriousness and deference. Before we began, I took from the pocket of my new jacket the cobalt blue USB drive and placed it gently on the table. Not for technical necessity, my new systems were far more advanced, but as a trophy, a memorial. The small scratch on the side, the scar of betrayal, was now also the mark of my turnaround, my ascent. I looked at the small object and thought, objects are like memories. Some carry weight, others carry power. The silence in the room was different. No one laughed, no one whispered, no one diminished my role. There I was seen. There my name was synonymous with security and authority. And deep down, I smiled, a genuine smile, from someone who had finally found their place. Because I learned in the hardest and most satisfying way that there is no more elegant and powerful revenge than turning humiliation into leadership. Whoever guards the key to trust is never truly invisible. They just wait for the right moment to be seen.